Joel Rifkin was born on January 20th, 1959, in New York City to unwed college students. Almost immediately after his birth, he was adopted by Benjamin and Jean Rifkin, a well-off couple living in Long Island, New York. The Rifkins provided Joel with a stable, middle-class life, aiming to give him all the support and love he needed to thrive. However, despite his adoptive parents' efforts, Joel faced many challenges growing up. In school, Rifkin struggled academically, particularly because he suffered from undiagnosed dyslexia. This learning difficulty made it challenging for him to keep up with his peers, and his academic performance lagged. His school environment became a source of embarrassment and frustration, fueling insecurities that would follow him for years. As he struggled to succeed in his studies, he became a frequent target of bullying. Classmates mocked him not only for his academic shortcomings but also for his introverted and awkward nature. This led to feelings of isolation, and by the time he reached high school he had withdrawn even further. In his teenage years, Rifkin began to find solace in his imagination, developing a fascination with violent fantasies and true crime stories. While these thoughts provided a temporary escape, they also began to reflect his desire for control, particularly in a world that had often made him feel powerless and unseen. His fantasies became a haven, one where he could envision himself as dominant rather than ostracized. Unfortunately, his lack of real friendships or meaningful connections drove him deeper into these fantasies. By the time he entered his 20s, his psychological landscape was one marked by frustration, alienation, and a disturbing fixation on power and control. In an attempt to turn his life around, Rifkin enrolled at the State University of New York at Brockport, hoping a fresh start would bring him the social connections and academic success he craved. However, his struggles with academics continued, and his social isolation only worsened. He dropped out and returned to Long Island, where he drifted between various odd jobs, living with his parents, and never establishing any career or relationship that gave him purpose. Over time, his frustration and anger grew, deepening the darkness within him. By the late 1980s, Rifkin's fantasies had evolved into something more dangerous. Living in a modest apartment in East Meadow, Long Island, he began hiring sex workers from New York City. To Rifkin, these women were not merely individuals, but representations of vulnerability and submission, embodying both allure and an inherent danger. His visits became frequent, driven by a twisted obsession with the power dynamics that these encounters presented. His first known victim, whom he referred to as Susie, was a 25-year-old sex worker he picked up in 1989. Unlike his previous interactions, this encounter took a dark turn. Something within him snapped, and, fueled by rage and a desire for control, he strangled her. This act of murder shook Rifkin, but not in the way one might expect. Rather than feeling remorse, he experienced an intoxicating sense of empowerment. Killing gave him a level of control he had never felt before, and he carefully disposed of Susie's body, meticulously dismembering her in his bathtub before scattering her remains across New York City. This marked the start of a spree of violence that would continue unchecked for years. Following the murder of Susie, Rifkin was unable to stop. His second victim came in 1990, and over the next 3 years, he would claim the lives of 17 women. These victims were mostly sex workers who lived on the margins of society. Rifkin selected them carefully, aware that their transient lifestyles and limited support networks would make them easy targets, unlikely to be missed or prioritized by law enforcement. His ability to evade capture was partly a product of this societal negligence. The police, under-resourced and often overwhelmed, struggled to connect the disappearances, and many of the missing person cases involving Rifkin's victims received little attention. Tragically, Rifkin's assessment of society's indifference toward these women was accurate. In his mind, he was committing the perfect crime. His victim's invisibility to society only reinforced his sense of control, and as he killed, he grew bolder. His methods were brutal. After luring each victim, he would often strangle them during or after sexual acts, sometimes beating them beforehand. He would then dismember their bodies in his bathtub, scattering the parts around New York City, Long Island, or nearby rivers, where they would be hard to trace. Each murder left him with a fleeting sense of satisfaction, but this soon faded, replaced by the same emptiness that had plagued him for years. This emptiness would drive him to kill again, in a cycle that seemed unbreakable. By 1992, Rifkin's murders had become routine, but his confidence led him to act more carelessly. His once meticulous disposal methods became sloppier. For instance, on one occasion, he neglected to weigh down a body he disposed of in the East River, resulting in the remains surfacing and sparking a brief investigation. But with no evidence linking him to the body, and no further leads, the case went cold. This incident should have served as a warning, but Rifkin's growing arrogance blinded him to the risks. He had evaded capture for years and believed he could continue indefinitely. In 1993, he killed Tiffany Bresciani, a young woman he picked up in New York City. This time, he barely took any precautions. The body was not properly hidden or disposed of, and the murder would ultimately lead to his downfall. Rifkin's increasing carelessness would cost him his freedom and end his horrific reign of violence. On June 28, 1993, Rifkin's luck ran out. He was driving his mother's pickup truck through Long Island, with Tiffany Bresciani's decomposing body wrapped in a blue tarp in the back. He had been aimlessly driving for days, unsure of where to dispose of her remains, when he noticed flashing lights in his rearview mirror. Police officers had stopped him for a missing license plate, intending to issue a simple citation. As the officers approached the truck, they caught the stench of decaying flesh. Suspicious, they demanded a search of the vehicle. Realizing there was no way to hide the body, Rifkin quietly confessed. His arrest marked the end of one of the most prolific killing sprees in New York's history. Rifkin was taken into custody and questioned, where he stunned investigators with a full confession. He admitted to killing 17 women, describing each murder with chilling detachment. Investigators were shocked by his lack of remorse and the casual, almost routine manner in which he recounted his crimes. For Rifkin, his victims were objects, tools through which he could exercise control and exercise his personal demons. As he recounted each murder, his revelations horrified detectives. The brutal, calculated nature of his actions left an indelible impression on them, and the families of his victims were left devastated by the details of their loved ones' fates. In an emotionless tone, Rifkin outlined his methods for luring, killing, and dismembering his victims, painting a haunting picture of a man devoid of empathy or guilt. Joel Rifkin's trial captivated the public, with the media covering every sordid detail. His defense team argued that he was mentally ill, citing his troubled childhood, low self-esteem, and history of bullying. They claimed that his psychological issues had driven him to murder. However, the calculated and systematic nature of his killings undermined these arguments. The court rejected his defense, noting that his ability to evade capture for so long indicated a high level of control and awareness. Rifkin was found guilty on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to 203 years in prison. Today, he remains incarcerated at the Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York. Occasionally, he grants interviews to criminologists and reporters, his chilling lack of remorse baffling those who study him. Joel Rifkin's case left a scar on New York and exposed society's failure to protect vulnerable populations, particularly sex workers. His murders highlighted the urgency of taking missing persons cases involving marginalized individuals more seriously. His ability to evade capture for so long prompted calls for reform within law enforcement agencies, emphasizing the need for increased resources for investigating cases involving the city's most at-risk residents. Public awareness of the dangers faced by sex workers grew, and advocates called for improved legal protections and resources for these individuals. Though much remains to be done, the case left a lasting impact on discussions around the vulnerability of marginalized populations and the need to approach such cases with urgency. In the years since his capture, criminologists and psychologists have tried to understand the mind of Joel Rifkin. Some believe his murders were attempts to regain the control he felt he lost in his childhood. Others argue that his actions point to a deeper psychological disorder, possibly antisocial personality disorder. Rifkin's lack of empathy, detachment from his actions, and objectification of his victims align with traits commonly associated with sociopathy. For criminologists, Joel Rifkin presents a fascinating yet horrifying case study in extreme alienation, violence, and the effects of untreated psychological issues. Experts who have studied his case suggest that Rifkin's feelings of inadequacy, rejection, and intense loneliness created a need to exert control in the only way he knew how: through violence. His early life, marked by constant rejection and social exclusion, likely planted seeds of resentment that, left unaddressed, later bloomed into homicidal rage. To others, Rifkin embodies characteristics of antisocial personality disorder, a condition marked by a disregard for social norms, manipulation, and a profound lack of empathy. His capacity to view his victims as objects to be disposed of rather than as human beings aligns with the detached cruelty often associated with sociopathy. Forensic psychologists have pointed out that, for Rifkin, these killings might have served as a form of self-therapy. Each murder provided him with a fleeting sense of power, a way to release the anger and frustration that had festered within him for decades. Yet each act also left him empty once again, leading him to seek out his next victim in a cycle of unending violence. While Rifkin's case has been dissected by criminologists, it also poses questions about mental health support and the ways in which society handles individuals who show signs of deep psychological distress. The story of Joel Rifkin, in many ways, is a reminder of the consequences that can arise when such warning signs go unnoticed or unaddressed. The story of Joel Rifkin is one that continues to haunt both New York and the broader true crime community. It serves as a grim reminder of the hidden dangers that can fester when societal systems fail to support vulnerable populations. Rifkin's brutal acts of violence highlight the importance of understanding mental health issues and the potential dangers of ignoring individuals in deep emotional or psychological turmoil. His life reflects not only his dark psychology, but also the tragic repercussions of a neglected mental health system. For the families of Rifkin's victims, the pain and trauma remain, their lives forever altered by his actions. These women were mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends, each with her own life, her own dreams, and her own story. The brutal nature of their deaths shattered the lives of their loved ones, who are left grappling with a reality where justice, even in the form of Rifkin's imprisonment, can never bring true closure. Additionally, the lack of urgency in investigating missing persons cases involving sex workers and marginalized women was thrown into stark relief. As a society, this case forced a reckoning. What does it mean to be valued, to be seen? For too long, these women had existed on the fringes of society, and their disappearances were met with indifference. Their tragic fates became a rallying cry for justice, igniting debates about law enforcement's responsibilities to protect all citizens, regardless of background or occupation. In the years since Rifkin's capture, his story has served as a dark, cautionary tale for law enforcement, mental health professionals, and society as a whole. His crimes have led to increased efforts to provide mental health resources and support for those who exhibit signs of psychological distress, particularly young people who show signs of social withdrawal and violent ideation. His case has also underscored the importance of vigilance and empathy toward individuals who feel isolated or marginalized, reminding us that failing to address such struggles can lead to devastating consequences. Rifkin's capture was a turning point in the recognition of systemic issues that allowed his crimes to continue for so long. His case urged New York City and surrounding areas to reconsider their approach to vulnerable populations, especially sex workers who, due to their circumstances, were often overlooked or treated as expendable. The media coverage and public reaction to Rifkin's crimes highlighted the need for reforms in handling cases involving missing persons from marginalized backgrounds. Beyond the legal and psychological implications, the story of Joel Rifkin carries a message about empathy and the importance of social intervention. His violent spree was, in part, an expression of the pain and loneliness that had simmered within him for years. While it does not excuse his actions, it brings to light the potential dangers of alienation and untreated psychological suffering. Years after Rifkin's sentencing, the impact of his crimes lingers. Families and friends of his victims still struggle with the loss of their loved ones. Many of these families became advocates for better protections and rights for vulnerable women, using their voices to demand justice for those whom society might otherwise ignore. Through memorials and advocacy work, they strive to ensure that the lives of Rifkin's victims are not forgotten, and that the dark legacy he left serves a constructive purpose. The haunting details of Rifkin's crimes also contributed to shifts in the way media and the public view serial killers and their victims. Many true crime enthusiasts and media outlets have moved towards focusing on victim stories rather than glorifying the violent acts of the killers themselves. In this way, the tragic story of Joel Rifkin has helped reshape the narrative, emphasizing the humanity of those who lost their lives to such violence. For those who study criminology, Rifkin's case offers valuable insights into the minds of serial killers, but it also highlights the systemic issues that can allow such predators to evade detection for so long. His case has become part of academic discourse on crime, violence, and social intervention, reminding students and scholars alike that each life has value and that no one should go unseen. The story of Joel Rifkin does not merely serve as a true crime tale. It's a mirror reflecting the cracks in societal structures. His crimes forced a reckoning on the dangers of overlooking individuals who may feel invisible, especially in urban environments where isolation and anonymity can breed a sense of disconnection. Rifkin's victims, too often dismissed as just sex workers, were in fact casualties of a society that too often ignores its most vulnerable. Through policies aimed at protecting marginalized women and improvements in mental health services, New York and other cities across the United States have taken steps to ensure that cases like Rifkin's do not repeat. Yet, despite these advances, the challenges remain formidable, as mental health services are still underfunded and sex workers continue to operate in dangerous conditions with little societal support. Joel Rifkin's legacy is a somber one. His crimes cost the lives of 17 women, their potential and dreams cut short by senseless violence. The system's failure to protect them and Rifkin's ability to evade capture for years highlight the need for a more compassionate, vigilant society that values every individual. In the end, Rifkin's story serves as a stark reminder of the importance of empathy, justice, and the moral imperative to protect society's most vulnerable members. Joel Rifkin's life and crimes represent a collision of personal tragedy, psychological breakdown, and societal failure. His story is a chilling example of the ways in which personal anguish, left unchecked, can spiral into violence. For criminologists, his case remains a subject of study, offering insights into the twisted psychology that underpins serial murder. For the public, it stands as a cautionary tale, a reminder that monsters are not born, but made, often in the shadows of neglect and societal indifference. Most importantly, for the families of his victims, Joel Rifkin's story is a deeply personal tragedy that will forever haunt them. As they work to keep the memories of their loved ones alive, their efforts serve as a reminder that behind every tragic story of true crime, there are real lives, real families, and a real cost. It is in remembering these individuals, not as victims but as people with hopes and dreams, that society finds a sense of justice, however belated it may be. In the end, the story of Joel Rifkin serves not only as a grim record of New York's history, but also as a call for compassion, vigilance, and a commitment to prevent similar tragedies from ever unfolding again.